I wouldn't say that I know the ending, but I know the feeling that it's going to end with. Like, so I know the tone of the end, I think. Kurt Vonnegut has this lecture that has been, I think I'm sure it's like gone around YouTube, where he talks about graphing the story of Cinderella. Um, and so he has his two axes, and uh the x-axis is time and the y-axis, I think he uses like fortune or prosperity or something, or happiness. And so you see how, like, she starts low, she goes high, she gets low, she gets high. So I think about that in terms of structuring a full novel. I haven't done it. I'm sure you probably could break it down and do it per scene too. But so, like, instead of using like the save the cat beats or the hero's journey or some of the other things people use, I sort of like to create my own little graph where you have, time is always the x-axis, and it's usually like narrative time. So it would be like time as the characters experience it, and then whatever sort of the key element of the book is going to be. So maybe it's like two characters in love, like they love each other, they hate each other, they love each other. Or it could be, she wins the lottery, she loses all the money, like whatever the story is going to be. So for Cinderella, again, it's a really basic one of like rags to riches to rags to riches. And so I know like where that point on the graph is going to be at the end. And I often have sort of like a vibe, I guess, that I'm going for. And I know like what I want the close to feel like, but I don't necessarily know like what is going to happen on like, this character says this and does this, and then this person does this basis. I just know sort of the feeling I want to be left with. Usually by the time I'm like two-thirds of the way through writing, I do know sort of like, okay, this is like the end scene. But when I start, like, I like to know where it's going on like a how it feels basis, but not necessarily on like how are we going to connect all the dots to get there. It helps structure a book in a way that for those of us who feel constrained by like very tight outlines, it still offers you a guide and you're sort of like following something and not just blindly sort of putting things out. So for Maddalena in the Dark, after my second book, had been writing something that just was not singing to me. It just, I don't know, I like wasn't totally into it. My agent wasn't totally into it. And I was just trying to think through like what other things might. And when I was a kid, I had listened to this book on tape. There's this series of sort of audiobooks for children called Classical Kids. And so it would be like a composer, and then it would be a fictional story of how the composer interacted with some child in their time period. And along the way, it would play like little bits of music. So, like, the most famous one, which I think got turned into a TV movie, was Beethoven Lives Upstairs. But there was one for Vivaldi called Vivaldi's Ring of Mystery. And from that, I had learned that Vivaldi taught violin, and sort of composed for this orchestra of like young female orphans in Venice in the 18th century. And I felt like, oh, there's a book there. Like, what better setting, and what better way to sort of have a setting that like provides story almost. So I started there, started reading more about it, became very interested in like the aspect of these teenage girls in competition with one another. And also sort of the Venetian society at the time was very unique in terms of the politics and the social structures. And the story sort of built out of that. But it required, I had not ever been to Venice when I started writing Maddalena in the Dark. And I wanted to go to Venice, but then it was a massive global pandemic. And then I planned a trip and there was a resurgence of pandemic and I pushed the trip back. So I actually didn't get there until I had sold the book. I had gone through all of my structural edits with my editor and I was sort of doing a last round of edits and I got to go. And it was, I don't know. I think it would have been a different book, obviously, had I been able to just wander Venice and stumble into things and add them. But it was really a lovely way to experience the city because I had done years of research and watched, video footage of it and knew what I was looking at and sort of how my story interacted with it in a really nice way. So it's sort of there's definitely an upside to not being able to travel until very late in the process. But I did go and I did find details where it's like, oh, this is wrong, or I have to add this in. And so luckily, that trip made it into the final round. It's funny, a lot of books I read start with like descriptions of characters, and I almost never have a visual description of the character until I'm like, oh, I guess I need this to know what people look like. I feel like my vision of them is a much more like internal, emotional, like what is it? I'm sure there's like an X-Man or something who is just like, glowing red, but I definitely have a visual and sort of sensory sense for, which is why, again, Venice worked so well because it's so specific. But with character, how did I think I had a very strong sense. There's two main characters in Maddalena and the Dark. There's Maddalena and then there's Louisa, and they have very different personalities. And the book trades back and forth between them in terms of who is telling the story. It's all third person, but it's close third, one and then the other. And with Maddalena, I immediately knew who she was and I understood her and I knew what she wanted and I knew sort of what she was willing to do to get it. And with Louisa, it was a lot harder because she began as like I needed her for the plot almost, and I had to get to know her and figure her out. And it took a lot longer for me to see things from her perspective and figure out what it was she wanted and sort of where she was coming from. But I think having that in mind and knowing I had such a strong character in Maddalena sort of gave me like in the past, I think I have written characters and they're not very fully fleshed out. And I miss that at first. And I'm like, oh, very late in the game, like this is not a person, this is a caricature. But because I knew right away that she was going to have to sort of hold up next to this other very strong character that felt like she had just sort of come to me out of the gate, I think that was ultimately a way to, catch it before she became too much of a cipher.